This is how you cross over from Israel to Gaza, and right now we're in no man's land.
Prime Minister, do you now regret when once asked what your favourite joke was, you replied, Nick Clegg? And Deputy Prime Minister, what do you think of that?
Mr. Trump, why should you be president? What makes you fit for the role? Is it just one big ego trip, Mr.
Thank you very much.
People aren't sure they can trust what you say. You say things and then it turns out that they're not quite what you said. My name's Andy Bell and I've been a journalist for over 30 years. In this podcast series, How Did We Get Here?, I aim to provide context and background to a big story in the news. This week, probably the most important political event of the year, the American presidential election. Coronavirus and the Black Lives Matter movement have thrown out the calculations that normally apply. When asked what any presidential election is about, one of Bill Clinton's team famously replied, "The economy, stupid." But this time, it's not so simple. To find out how the unique events of 2020 are shaping the race this time round, I turned to Chief Correspondent of the Washington Post, Dan Balz. Did he think, at the start of the year, that Donald Trump had been looking pretty confident?
Yeah, I mean, I do think he felt reasonably confident. The economy was in quite good shape. I think the unemployment rate at the beginning of the year was in the neighborhood of 3.6%, which is, the lowest it's been in half a century or so. And the stock market was doing very, very well. He was heading into a Senate trial on impeachment, but everybody knew that that outcome would be that he would be acquitted. And I think that he was looking forward to coming out of that and in a sense be liberated, that he would be able to run the kind of reelection campaign he wanted. Having said that, I don't think anybody doubted, including the people around him, that this was going to be a very tough reelection. His overall approval rating is, at its good points, it's 48 or 49, and for most of the time he's been president, it's been pretty much below that. That's not a good, strong place from which to launch a reelection campaign. So some indicators look very good for him, but I think he did have a sense of confidence about it. I think that they thought that the Democratic Party was going to go through a tumultuous and potentially quite divisive nominating process. And so, he probably woke up by the end of the impeachment and said, things look pretty good for me, and I think I'm going to be able to be reelected.
And then, as we all know, a lot of things changed. Let's take the coronavirus first. In terms of the way he has handled that, this is obviously a very big question. Yeah, what is the perception of the way Donald Trump has handled the coronavirus?
Well, it's exceedingly negative. And it's gotten worse quite recently. It's never been good, other than right at the very beginning of the pandemic, when not at the very beginning, but when he kind of made a turn from being talking about that this was going to end fairly quickly to a point where he got serious about it. And at that point, his approval rating on dealing with the pandemic went up to, was in around 50 or 51%. But since then, and particularly in the most recent period, as we have seen the number of cases spread dramatically, and in states like Florida and Texas and Arizona, as a result of that, his numbers have gone very, very much in the wrong direction, frankly.
What is it that he's done or not done, do you think, that has actually got through to people in terms of them thinking this guy is not handling this well?
Well, I think there's just such a disconnect between what he says and what people can see with their own eyes. He's at odds with the scientists in his own administration. He's at odds with experts outside of the administration. And so I think there is a perception that he has not taken it seriously. He has ignored a lot of the available evidence, that he is trying to, in a sense, will the country to a point that it can't get to. So, and I think people recognize that. And, they watch his daily behavior and they say, this is a president who is out of touch with the reality of what this pandemic is doing. He has also politicized it significantly so that a number of these issues are now Republican versus Democrat. And that is not helpful to him in a reelection context.
Just to expand on that, when you talk these issues, you're talking about issues to do with the science, the medicine, how you actually deal with the pandemic.
Yes, the biggest one is the use of masks. Now, he went to Walter Reed Military Hospital over the weekend and wore a mask, but it's the first time he's been photographed wearing a mask throughout the entirety of the pandemic. And every expert at this point says one of the things that people not only can do but should do is wear a mask. And that's, not just in this country, it's everywhere. And he has systematically resisted that. And now there are many, many Republicans who agree with that and have taken it on as kind of a cause that for whatever reason, it impinges on their freedom or their liberties. And so something that would be very helpful to help constrain and contain the virus is not working because there's a significant part of the country that says, no, we're not going to wear masks. We don't believe it's necessary. He urged the states to open their economies very early. And the Center for Disease Control and Prevention issued guidelines, but a number of states more or less ignored those guidelines. And in the reopening, what we've seen is there are now spikes in a number of those places because people stopped social distancing and they went into bars and they did things they shouldn't have done. And Trump has always been he's been on the wrong side of those issues. He's not led in the direction that the science says so, and people recognize it. Let me give you one statistic. In early June, only 30% of the people in the country thought that the pandemic was getting worse. By the end of June, 65% said it's getting worse. And through that period, the president was not suggesting that it was getting worse. He was doing the opposite, that it was, everything was under control.
I just want to put in, though, that I've seen the pictures of people who are clearly, who share the president's view that basically you don't have to wear a mask and that this is something that is not based on science and it's political in a sense. Is this firing up his base, this sort of position he's taken? Could that help him in getting the votes on board when the time comes? If you make this a matter of, even in the issue of how to deal with the pandemic, it becomes a political cause.
Well, he's doing everything he can to fire up his base. I would not say he's trying to fire up the base on the basis of wearing or not wearing masks, although there is a division on that. But he is firing up the base on other issues, particularly the broad issue of law and order. We had the massive protests here, and you all had some there after the killing of George Floyd. And there's a racial reckoning moment that's underway in this country as Americans grapple with the history of slavery and discrimination against Black people. Some of those demonstrations did turn violent. And the president has tried to rally his people by saying that there is now a left-wing movement basically to destroy the country, to destroy the values of the country, to tear down statues of our founders, et cetera, et cetera. So he's trying to rally the base in that way. And that has always been a key to his reelection strategy, which is turn out not just the people who voted for him, but like-minded people who simply did not vote at all in 2016. Identify them, find them, get them registered to vote, and then turn them out. That's a core strategy of what he's doing. And so in any way that he can rerun the 2016 campaign by running against elites and so-called experts and now the left, he's trying to do that. Will it pay off? It could. I mean, it worked certainly in 2016, but he starts, I think, from a worse position this time than he did 4 years ago.
Okay, we'll come back to that. But that idea that you've touched on there, that there may well be people who didn't vote for Donald Trump last time, but who may well look at the pictures on their TV screens of the demonstrations, and some of them turned violent, and be ready to respond to a message which says, well, kind of, whose side are you on? Are you on the side of the people smashing things up, or are you on the side of the police? And some people might, who might think, well, I didn't really want to vote for Donald Trump, but maybe that's the guy who's talking about law and order.
Yes, and this was a successful strategy of Richard Nixon in the 1968 election in this country, when there were huge protests after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in April of that year. And that was a year when there was also the assassination of Bobby Kennedy and anti-war protests. It was a tumultuous year. Nixon used the law and order theme effectively and won a narrow victory. It's not clear that the same conditions apply this time. I mean, there are a number of changes. One, this is a much different country than it was in 1968. It's a much more diverse country. And so some of the tactics that might have worked in that time may not work this time. There's another element to it, and that is that despite the fact that there has been violence in some of these protests, broadly stated, there has been support for the Black Lives Matter movement and for the protests. Now, some of that polling is several weeks old, and so we will look in the next few weeks to see the degree to which that has held, or whether the argument that Donald Trump is advancing is getting some traction. But it is harder to run that kind of campaign in the country that we have today than it was many years ago. Okay,
well, obviously a lot of the focus is on Donald Trump, but he's up against a man, Joe Biden, former vice president, maybe not the person that everybody would have expected to emerge, I don't know, from the Democratic nomination process, but he has. Is Joe Biden getting any kind of traction?
Well, he's getting traction because President Trump is losing ground. And so he has benefited enormously from the kind of self-inflicted wounds that Trump has had this spring. And we have watched as the polls have moved in his direction from the time that the pandemic shut everything down to where we are now in early July, 4 months before the election. He has stayed mostly at his home in Delaware, partly because there's not many places that you can go to these days, partly out of a precaution. I mean, he is 77 years old, and so Joe Biden is in the high risk category, and there was concern, I would say, a couple of months ago among many Democrats that by staying at home, not engaging directly, not doing rallies or not doing much of anything, he was putting at risk his hope of winning the election. And the Biden campaign came under pressure to do more. But I think that they decided they were going to kind of tough it out and stick with the strategy that they've had. And to date, it has been successful. Now, we're entering a different period. We're entering a period when soon the two national parties will have their political conventions. There will be debates in the fall. So there's some very, very big events. The former vice president has to pick a running mate. So there's a lot that can yet happen. But so far, Biden has benefited from the strategy that he has adopted. He's begun to come out a little bit more. He gave a big speech on economics last week, and the campaign is more aggressive in kind of tweaking President Trump. But for the most part, they've played a fairly patient game.
How has Joe Biden navigated the Black Lives Matter issue? Because obviously there's a danger he can, disappoint, the people maybe within the Democrat Party who might want him to sort of go a bit further. And then there's the danger, I suppose, he might alienate sort of not people who are registered as Democrats who might think, hang on, you're going too far down a road I don't like. How has he managed to navigate that issue?
Very, very carefully. And I don't know that he's fully successfully navigated it. One thing that happened a few weeks ago was there was the movement, so-called defund the police part of the Black Lives Matter agenda. And this is obviously a fraught issue to say, let's defund the police. It's actually part of a wider discussion about resources and how much resources should go into local policing as opposed to certain kinds of investments in black communities and for social workers rather than police to deal with it. But be that as it may, when this came front and center, Biden was asked about it and immediately said, "No, I am against the defund the police." He has since not backtracked on that, but indicated that he's open to shifting some of the resources. There are two ways to think about the black community in this context. One is older black Americans who are probably Biden's strongest supporters. These are the voters who came out in South Carolina in the primary and saved his candidacy and ultimately propelled him to the nomination. I think for older black Americans, Joe Biden is just fine on these issues. For younger black Americans, there is some skepticism. And in the past few weeks, I've talked to a number of black scholars who say that, in essence, there was disappointment on the part of a number of black Americans that Biden had so quickly kind of squashed the debate about defunding the police. Politically, it was probably an understandable move, but it is an indication of exactly what you asked about, which is navigating that is very difficult when you're thinking about the different audiences of potentially persuadable and or core voters that you need in November.
How about the question of who he picks for his running mate? That must be becoming pretty important and presumably will be settled reasonably soon? Reasonably
soon. He had indicated that he wanted to try to make an announcement or make a decision by August 1st. That timetable, I believe, has slipped somewhat, as these things tend to do, but he will do it before his convention, which starts in mid-August now. And so sometime in the first 10 days of August, I would expect that we will get a decision. They are in the process of vetting a number of potential candidates, and these vets are deep and intrusive, I might say, having talked to people who've gone through them in the past. He's under pressure to pick an African-American woman. He has said that he has pledged to pick a woman as his running mate, and as a result of the protests over George Floyd's killing, the pressure to pick an African-American running mate is all that much higher. He has a number of choices, 3, 4, 5, 6 potential people who fit in that category. But picking a running mate is a very difficult thing. There are obviously political considerations that go into it, but there's also personal chemistry. And
what about Senator Kamala Harris is the obvious one that comes to mind?
Well, she is the obvious one because she's the one who has been elected statewide in a very big state. She had a dust-up with the former vice president at the first debate a little more than a year ago when she took him on the very issue of race and whether his history as an opponent of forced busing of school children was an indication of his values on race. And he took great umbrage on that. He takes pride in his position on race. But I don't know whether that has left a sour taste in his mouth or not about that. But she's an obvious person to pick. And I think that if everybody were betting, they would say she's the betting favorite. But there are several others who have figured into the discussion of late.
People have said pretty mean things about each other and then ended up getting on the same ticket in the past, haven't they?
Well, George H.W. Bush described Reagan's economic plan as voodoo economics and ended up as the running mate and eventually the president after 8 years of Reagan. So, yes, you're absolutely right. These things can easily be put into the background.
I just want to ask you, just before we close, I mean, for instance, in America, the way the system works for the election of the president, it's not just whoever gets the most votes. Can you just explain that to us again, the way choosing the president actually works?
Certainly. Everybody votes, and there is a popular vote that is calculated on the basis of all of those votes. But the popular vote does not elect a president. You get elected by winning in what we call the Electoral College. And this is a state-by-state competition. Every state gets a set number of electors, and that's based on the size of the state. There's 2 for each state for each of their senators, and then the size of their congressional delegation adds the additional number. So California is by far the biggest, and some states have only 3 or so electoral votes, and everybody's in between. You have to win a majority of the electoral vote. Of that 538 total votes, you have to win 270 to be elected president. And 4 years ago, Donald Trump lost the popular vote to Hillary Clinton by about 3 million votes, but was able to win an Electoral College majority by winning very narrowly 3 states in the upper Midwest, the states of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, which he won by a combined total of about 77,000 votes. That's what made him president, and that's where the competition is today. That he will almost certainly lose the popular vote and could lose it by an even larger number of votes than 4 years ago. But the competition is in the Electoral College in the state-by-state battles.
I just want to pick up that comment there, which I think people will be amazed at when they hear that figure. 77,000 votes decided 3 states with
Yes.
the way they went in the Electoral College.
Yes, yeah.
That's an extraordinarily small figure to decide the presidency.
You can see why the Democrats were so distraught when the final votes were tallied, that they had assumed that Hillary Clinton was going to win, and those votes came in, and she lost all 3 of those states narrowly, and that was the game.
I have to say, I was in I think the Kravitz Center in New York on that evening, and it was a pretty extraordinary moment when you realized quite what was going on when everyone had turned up there for the Hillary Clinton victory party, which never materialized. But anyway, so those 3 states, for instance, is that Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin? How is it looking there this time around as far as we can judge?
Right now, it looks pretty good for Joe Biden. He is leading in each of those states by 4, 5, 6 points. But Hillary Clinton was ahead in those states at this point 4 years ago by not quite that amount, but in the neighborhood of that. And things changed. Again, I say that I think Trump's in a tougher position this year than he was 4 years ago, but these mid-July numbers are not indicative of much more than where they are now. I think there are 3 other states of note which will decide this election. Florida, which Trump again narrowly carried last time around. That has been a competitive battleground for the last 2 decades and will continue to be so this time. The state of North Carolina, Obama won it once, he lost it once, and Trump won it in 2016. And then Arizona, which has historically been a pretty Republican state. It's gone Democratic a couple of times, but a pretty strongly Republican state, but one that is changing demographically in significant ways. And it is a competitive state this time around. So those are the 6 states that are probably most on people's minds in the 2 campaigns. And at this point, Biden is leading in, I believe, all of them. More narrowly in Arizona and North Carolina, but he is leading in all of them. So he starts the final, summer into fall drive in a relatively good position. But his campaign, A, assumes that these polls are kind of the high watermark and that they will tighten. And B, they all knew what happened to them 4 years ago, and they're not going to let down.
Okay, I've got 2 quick questions for you now before we finish. One, what should we watch out for between now and November?
Well, I think a couple of things. One is the state of the economy. The unemployment rate I mentioned at the beginning of the year was 3.5%. It's currently 11%. And we're at a point where, a month ago, we might have thought that number would continue to go down because it had gone down from May to June. But because some of these states have experienced trouble with the pandemic, they're having to shut the economies down somewhat. So this recovery is going to be slow and bumpy. And that is a big factor. The second is the pandemic. Between early or late August and I would say late September, we're going to have schools that are reopening in one form or another, some more so than others. We're going to have colleges and universities that are going to be inviting students back to campus in some form or another. we will have to see what that does in terms of cases and new cases of the coronavirus and how people are experiencing that. So that's another thing. And then I would say the debates this year will be very, very important. Both candidates believe that the debates will benefit them. Those start at the end of September. There will be 3 presidential debates unless something changes, and 1 vice presidential debate. And those will be the 3 big events in the fall. And it's unlikely that there's going to be a lot of traditional rallying of the kind that you're used to seeing when you come here to cover a campaign.
What would you say if you were advising Joe Biden going into a TV debate? What would you say to him about the other guy?
I never give advice to candidates, so he has smart people around him who can strategize better than I.
Let me put it differently then. I mean, what would you say would be the danger for Joe Biden going up against Donald Trump in a TV debate?
Well, I think the danger for him is the question that the Trump campaign is working very hard to implant in everybody's minds, which is that Joe Biden has lost more than a step, that he's lost many steps, that he's just not sharp. The Trump campaign has been quite, they've been completely unsubtle about that in some of the advertising they've done. And I think that if there were a debate in which the former vice president stumbled badly or looked like he couldn't remember things or, completely mangled his words, those kinds of things, that could cause a problem.
Because that has happened, hasn't it, on the campaign already?
It has, yes. So there were some early debates in particular where he did have some difficulty, and I think that it opened up the idea that he might not make it to the finish line as the nominee. He got better over time, and so I think his people believe that in a one-on-one debate and a one-on-one debate with President Trump, that he will be able to hold his own. But you never know what's going to happen in a big high pressure event like that. And I think both Trump and Biden will do everything they can to throw the other one off his balance.
I mean, Trump was pretty good at that. I seem to remember with Hillary Clinton 4 years ago. He
was good at that. I think there's one other thing to remember, though, and that is that incumbent presidents often have a tough time with their first debate in a reelection campaign. We certainly saw that with Barack Obama in 2012 when he and Mitt Romney debated for the first time, and Obama was just not up to the speed he needed to be, and Romney was totally sharp that night, and really it was one of the more lopsided debates that I've witnessed. Trump will have to avoid having that problem in the same way that Joe Biden will have to avoid having a stumble of, mangling his words or forgetting things.
Okay, and I promise you this is the final question. So I hate to do this to you. Who's going to get it?
The one who gets 270 or more electoral votes.
No. Do you feel right now, if I forced you to say to put some money down on one side or the other, who do you think?
Well, I mean, if I'll do it this way, because I'm not going to get ahead of the story. If the election were held today, I believe Donald Trump would not be reelected. But the election's in almost 4 months, so we'll see. I mean, given everything that's happened this year, we would all be wise to be a little bit humble about how we project forward. Nobody anticipated the events that we have been through this year, and so we don't know what's coming.
Dan, that sounds like extremely good advice, and I should have heeded it before I asked you that question. But thank you very much, Dan Balz from the Washington Post, for talking to us here for How Do We Get Here. It's going to be great. It's going to be very, very interesting and even more fascinating than usual. And maybe talk again in November. Okay, cheerio.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dan.
Thanks a lot.
The chief correspondent of the Washington Post, Dan Balz, with some very good advice about not getting ahead of the story. And certainly the point of this podcast should be to talk more about what we already know rather than go charging off into speculation. So I should try and remember that. If you have thoughts on this or ideas for any other podcast, email me on andy.bell@itn.co.uk, and I'm tweeting at @AndyBell5News, and you can read more from Dan at @DanBalz. Thanks for listening to this edition of How Did We Get Here? There'll be another one along soon.